Grant Corsaro hadn't slept in 4 days, and it wasn't the bullet that missed his temple by 3 centimeters that kept him awake. It was the fact that only 3 people in this world knew which car he'd be in that night, and he trusted every single one of them. That's the thing about betrayal most people don't understand. It doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the person sitting across from you at dinner, the one who's poured your whiskey for as long as you can remember, the one who'd take a bullet for you, or at least that's what you've always believed. Grant was 36, built like a man who'd learned to fight before he'd learned to read, ran an empire stretching from the ports of Newark to the private rooms of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants, and hadn't shown fear since the night his father bled out on a warehouse floor when he was 28. But tonight, standing in front of a one-way mirror watching a surgeon reshape his greatest enemy's face into an exact copy of his own, Grant Corsaro felt something he couldn't name, something worse than fear, something closer to the feeling you get when you realize you've just handed the keys to your entire life to a man who's killed 12 people and smiled through every single one. His plan was simple. Let the copy run the empire in plain sight while Grant disappeared into the shadows to hunt the traitor from within. What he didn't plan for, what no man ever plans for, was that his enemy wouldn't just steal his throne, his money, or his men's loyalty. He'd steal something Grant didn't even know he was capable of losing. The woman who'd been waiting for him every night for 3 years, the one person who made him believe a man like him deserved something soft in this world. Her name was Lydia Shaw, 27, grew up in foster care, worked night shifts, stitching up gunshot wounds without asking questions, and she'd fallen in love with Grant, not because of what he was, but because of what he couldn't hide. And now she was sleeping next to a stranger wearing her fiancé's face, and she didn't know it yet. But here's what neither the copy nor the traitor counted on. Lydia didn't survive a lifetime of being passed from home to home by being naive. She survived by learning to read people the way most people read books, and the man lying next to her? He was missing a scar, a small one, just below the left collarbone, from a fight Grant got into at 15. Not over territory, not over money, but over a stray cat. And that one missing scar was about to unravel everything. If this story already has you hooked, smash that like button so more people can find it. Share it with someone who loves a good plot twist. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. You don't want to miss what's coming. Now let's go back to the night it all started, the night a bullet changed everything. The passenger side window exploded a fraction of a second before the gunshot ever reached their ears. Warren Brecker reacted in less than a heartbeat, his left hand grabbing the back of Grant's collar and yanking him down across the seat, while his right hand had already pulled the Glock from the shoulder holster and aimed it toward the shattered window. His voice tore through the car as he slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, roaring with the instinctive force of a former Marine who'd spent too many years living beside the sound of bullets. The car surged forward through the Manhattan rain, tires slicing through water along Lexington Avenue, red lights becoming a luxury nobody cared about anymore. Grant lay sideways across the back seat, shards of broken glass glittering across his shoulders, while blood from a cut near his temple slid slowly down the collar of his dress shirt. Warren sat gripping his weapon, ignoring the sharp burn in his right shoulder, where a bullet had torn through the fabric of his suit jacket just moments ago. He didn't speak. He counted. 3 people knew tonight's schedule. Conrad Tate, the man who arranged the dinner. Warren Brecker, the man driving escort. And Lydia, the woman he'd told he would be home late. Warren sat beside him now, gun aimed through the ruined window, the cold wind and rain rushing through the shattered glass as the blood from the cut on his forehead began to coarsen and dry against his skin. Lydia didn't know where he was having dinner, only that he would be home late. That left one person. The car reached the Long Island estate 11 minutes after midnight. Grant stepped out into the rain without rushing, without lowering his head, and walked straight into the first-floor study before sitting down in the chair without turning on the lights. Warren remained at the doorway, wiping blood from his forehead with his sleeve. "I'll call Conrad." Grant neither nodded nor shook his head. He simply said, "Call him." Conrad Tate arrived within 20 minutes, faster than usual, faster than a man who'd supposedly been asleep in a Tribeca penthouse 40 minutes away should have arrived. Grant noticed that, but said nothing. Conrad walked into the room, saw the blood on Grant's collar, and his expression changed exactly the way it should have changed, with precisely the right amount of concern. Worried, but not panicked. Angry, but controlled. His hand gripped Grant's shoulder for a brief second before letting go. "Who was it?" Conrad asked. "Don't know yet." "How many shots?" "1." "From where?" Rooftop southeast of the building, about 200 meters. Sniper rifle. Conrad nodded slowly. Then he asked again, more quickly this time. What time did you leave the restaurant? Front exit or back exit? Which side was the car parked on? Who knew you were there tonight? The right questions. Too right, too fast, too detailed for a man who'd just been awakened at midnight and rushed over because he was worried about his younger brother. Those weren't the questions of a frightened man. They were the questions of someone checking where the plan had failed. Grant looked at Conrad through the darkness and felt something for the first time in all the decades of knowing him. It wasn't proof. It wasn't fact. It was instinct. The instinct of a man who'd survived the underworld long enough to understand that when something feels wrong, it's usually been wrong for a very long time before you finally see it. But he said nothing. He only nodded once and answered, I'll figure it out. Warren brought him the bullet the following morning. It had been dug out of the side panel of the car, still intact enough to identify. A 338 Lapua Magnum round, with a hand-polished Sinar tip. The kind manufactured only through custom orders by a weapons workshop operated by the Corsaro family on the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey. Not ammunition bought on the black market. Not ammunition belonging to the Albright family or any outside rival. This was family ammunition. Manufactured by family. Fired by family. Grant sat alone in the study, the bullet resting on the oak desk in front of him, and understood that the man who wanted him dead had never needed to climb over the walls to get inside, because he'd been carrying the key for a very long time. Grant picked up the bullet, slowly turning it between his thumb and forefinger, and made a decision that anyone else in his position would have called insane. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. He wouldn't hunt for the traitor by interrogating every man around him until somebody finally broke. He would disappear from his own life and allow the traitor to believe everything was unfolding according to plan. Because traitors only reveal themselves when they think they've already won, and Grant Corsaro intended to give him exactly that feeling. Lydia heard the car pull into the driveway close to 1 o'clock in the morning. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago, still wearing her night shift scrubs because she never changed clothes before he came home. Never once had in all this time, as though staying in her work clothes was the only way to keep herself awake enough to wait for him. She heard the car door shut, footsteps crunching across the gravel, then the front door opening. Grant stepped into the kitchen, and Lydia saw the dried blood on the collar of his shirt before she even saw his face. She didn't scream. She didn't rush to her feet. She stood slowly, calmly, walked to the medicine cabinet, and took out gauze and antiseptic with the practiced hands of a woman accustomed to blood, hands that had stitched gunshot wounds on strangers at 3 a.m. in the Brooklyn emergency room without trembling. But now her hands shook. Not because of blood, because this blood was his. She stood in front of Grant, gently tilted his head to one side, and cleaned the cut near his temple with wet gauze. He didn't flinch. He only looked at her with the eyes she had spent 3 years learning how to read. Eyes that never said, I'm scared, but sometimes, in moments like this, quietly whispered, I'm still here. She asked softly without looking up. Who? Don't know yet. And when you find out? Grant fell silent for a moment. I'll do what needs to be done. Lydia didn't ask anything else. She placed a small bandage over the wound, smoothed the edges flat with her fingertips, then stepped back. No embrace, no tears. She simply looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had chosen to stand beside a man like Grant Corsaro and live with everything that decision carried with it. Then she returned to the kitchen table, sat down, and drank a sip of cold tea. Grant pulled out the chair across from her, and they sat there together in silence, because silence was their language, a language born on the first night they met 3 years earlier in the emergency room at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. Lydia had been 24 years old that night, just finishing a 12-hour shift and preparing to leave when the emergency room doors burst open. 2 men carried in a third, blood pouring through the t-shirt pressed against his stomach, while his eyes had already begun to glaze over. No paperwork, no insurance. One of the men carrying him said, "Save him and I'll pay cash." And Lydia didn't ask a single question. She called the attending physician, prepared the equipment, arranged the transfusion, and when the doctor took 15 minutes to come downstairs, because he'd been asleep in the 3rd-floor call room, it was Lydia herself who pressed against the wound, held the dying man's pulse steady, and told him, "You are not dying on my shift. You hear me." In such a calm voice that both men standing beside the bed fell completely silent. The man survived. Grant Corsaro arrived at 5 in the morning. He entered the emergency room through the back entrance, wearing a black suit, his hair combed straight back, and everyone in the room understood they shouldn't look at him for too long, without anybody needing to explain why. He looked at the wounded soldier lying in the bed, looked at the blood on the floor, then looked at Lydia. She was washing her hands at the sink, still wearing blood-stained scrubs, her ponytail half falling apart, dark circles beneath her eyes after 12 straight hours on her feet. He asked, "What's your name?" Lydia didn't turn around. She shut off the water, dried her hands, then finally looked at him. "What's her name?" "What?" "The woman lying over there. The woman you didn't call an ambulance for because you were afraid the police would ask questions you didn't want to answer. What's her name? Or do you only learn people's names while they're still useful to you?" Grant stared at her without blinking. He didn't answer. He turned and walked away. Lydia thought that would be the last time she ever saw him. But the next night, when she finished her shift at 11 o'clock and stepped out the hospital's back entrance, he was standing beside a black car parked across the street. He said nothing. He simply stood there. She looked at him, he looked at her, and she walked toward the subway station without turning back. The second night, he was there again. The third night, too. By the fourth night, rain was falling, and he still stood there beneath it without an umbrella. Lydia stopped walking. She stood beneath the hospital doorway, staring at the man she knew was dangerous, knew belonged to a world she should never step into, standing in the rain as though he'd stay there for as long as it took, for however many nights it took, until she finally decided to speak to him, or until he died of pneumonia, whichever came first. She crossed the street. "What's your name?" "Grant." "Grant, you've been standing here 4 nights. 5. The third night you got off early. I came and you were already gone." She looked at him beneath the rain, water running down his face, and she saw something perhaps very few people had ever seen in Grant Corsaro. Not weakness, endurance. The way he stood there night after night wasn't because he wanted to prove something. It was because he simply didn't know any other way. He didn't know how to knock on a door and say, "I want to know more about you." He only knew how to show up, stay silent, and wait. That was how Grant Corsaro loved. Through presence instead of words, through actions instead of emotion. He would kill anyone who threatened her, yet he wouldn't be the first to say, "I love you." He would build steel walls around her, yet never ask how her day had been. He protected her from the entire world, but he never understood that sometimes what she needed wasn't protection at all. Sometimes all she needed was a hand against her face and someone saying, "I'm here." And that, exactly that, would become the crack someone else eventually stepped through. It took Grant 10 days to find Leon Hargrove, not because Leon was skilled at hiding, but because he was the kind of man the FBI, the DEA, and federal marshals had spent 6 years hunting without ever laying a hand on him. Leon Hargrove, 38 years old, kingpin of a narcotics network stretching from Florida to New England. 12 confirmed murders attached to his name, though the real number was probably twice that. His face sitting on the FBI's most wanted list in the category federal agents privately referred to as "can't be captured, only buried." But Grant Corsaro wasn't the FBI. Grant possessed things the FBI never would. An underground network spread across the East Coast, debtors in every social class imaginable, and a willingness to do things the law wouldn't even allow itself to think about. He found Leon inside an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district south of Newark, New Jersey, where Leon was hiding with 2 gunmen guarding the entrance and a laptop filled with enough evidence to keep a man imprisoned for 300 years. Warren dealt with the 2 guards in silence. Grant entered the warehouse alone. Leon sat in a folding chair at the center of the building, half a cigarette still hanging between his fingers, and when he saw Grant Corsaro step through the rusted steel doorway, he didn't stand. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for the handgun resting 1 arm's length away on the table beside him. He simply tilted his head, took another drag from the cigarette, and smiled as though greeting a guest he'd been expecting for a very long time. "Grant Corsaro," Leon said, exhaling smoke slowly into the cold air. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." That was what made Leon more dangerous than almost every criminal Grant had ever faced. Not the guns, not the money. It was that calmness, that ability to sit perfectly still while everything around him burned to the ground, and look at another man with the eyes of someone who'd already understood him before he even opened his mouth. Leon Hargrove was a master manipulator, the kind of man who could look into your eyes and know exactly what you feared, what you loved, what you hid from the world, then use those very things to control you so skillfully that you'd thank him while he did it. Grant pulled out a chair and sat across from him, their knees almost touching. He watched Leon for a long moment without speaking, because Grant also understood the power of silence, and in their world, the first man to speak was the man who needed something more. Leon finished the cigarette and crushed it against the concrete floor. You didn't come here to kill me. If you had, I'd already be dead before seeing your face. So what do you want? Grant answered without hesitation, without games. I need your face to disappear, and I need my face to appear on somebody else. Leon fell silent for a beat. Then he laughed. Not the laughter of a cornered man, the laughter of someone who'd just heard the most interesting proposition of his entire life. You want me to become you. I want a surgeon to turn your face into mine. You play me in front of the Empire while I investigate from outside. When it's finished, you get a new face. Your FBI file disappears. I've got people inside the Department of Justice, $10 million in cash, and your freedom. Go wherever you want. Leon leaned back in the chair, studying Grant with eyes that anyone else might have mistaken for thoughtful. But Grant understood what he was really doing. Measuring. Weighing. Searching for weaknesses in both the offer and the man making it. You're desperate, Leon said quietly. I can smell desperation. It doesn't smell like fear. It smells like a man trying to control something that slipped out of his hands a long time ago. Grant didn't react. You want to find the traitor, Leon continued, which means you don't trust anyone around you. You, the great Corsaro boss, the man ruling half the East Coast, sitting in an abandoned warehouse in Newark at 2 a.m. because you've got nobody left to trust. Interesting. Leon rose slowly from the chair and stepped closer to Grant, close enough that Grant could smell cigarette smoke and cheap whiskey on his breath. I'll do it, Leon said. Not for the money, not for freedom. I want to know what it feels like to become Grant Corsaro, to live in your house, give orders to your people, watch the world bow its head in front of me. I'll become you better than you ever were. Grant stood. He towered half a head taller than Leon. He reached up and grabbed Leon's jaw in one hand, thumb and forefinger tightening just enough for Leon to understand that the distance between this conversation and death was far thinner than he imagined. You are a puppet, Grant said, his voice low and deliberate, every word placed down like a knife laid carefully across a table. I pull the strings. You speak when I tell you to speak. You stay silent when I tell you to stay silent. You look my people in the eyes and perform exactly the role I wrote for you. If you step out of line even once, I won't need the FBI to bury you. Leon looked up at Grant beneath the hand gripping his jaw and smiled. That smile would stay with Grant for a very long time afterward, because it wasn't the smile of a man who'd been subdued. It was the smile of a man who had just found exactly what he needed, a doorway into somebody else's life, already opened for him by the owner himself. Dr. Hale Pemberton was the kind of man society called a genius, and the underworld called a tool. 55 years old, silver hair cut neatly short, the steadiest surgical hands on the entire East Coast of America. He had spent 11 years serving with the United States Marshals Service inside the WITSEC program, where his job was turning witnesses into strangers, erasing old faces and building new ones for people who would be killed before reaching trial if anyone recognized them. He left the program 6 years earlier and opened a private clinic in Greenwich, Connecticut, catering to wealthy clients desperate to look 10 years younger at $200,000 a procedure. But Hale Pemberton had one weakness no amount of talent could save him from: gambling. $2,300,000 in debt, spread neatly across 3 underground casinos, all of them controlled by the Corsaro family. Grant didn't need to threaten him. He only had to place the sheet, listing the debt across the table, then set beside it a photograph of Pemberton's wife and 2 daughters eating breakfast on the back porch of their home. Pemberton looked at the paper, looked at the photograph, then quietly asked, "When do we begin?" The surgery took place in the basement of an isolated mansion outside Westport, Connecticut, a property Grant owned through a shell corporation even Conrad knew nothing about. Pemberton spent 2 full days preparing, photographing, measuring, mapping every angle of Grant's face with millimeter precision. Leon lay on the operating table with his eyes open, staring at the white ceiling beneath the surgical lights, smiling until the anesthesia finally dragged him under. 14 hours. Pemberton worked for 14 uninterrupted hours, cutting, reshaping, rebuilding, grafting, adjusting every line of cheekbone, every angle of jaw, every fold of eyelid until the face lying on that table no longer belonged to Leon Hargrove. It belonged to a second version of Grant Corsaro. Grant sat outside the operating room, watching through one-way glass for all 14 of those hours, and sometime around the 9th hour, just after Pemberton completed the nose and lip structure, Grant saw his own face lying motionless on the body of an enemy, eyes closed, looking almost like a corpse laid out for burial. He had to turn away for several seconds before he could force himself to look back again. 3 weeks of recovery followed. Leon remained inside a sealed room beneath the basement, his face wrapped entirely in bandages, examined daily by Pemberton, fed through tubes, unable to speak for the first 10 days because his jaw still hadn't stabilized. On the 11th day, when the bandages finally came off for the first time, Leon stood before the mirror without speaking for a very long while. He lifted a hand to his face, touching every new line, every unfamiliar angle, while Grant stood behind him, watching his enemy touch the face that belonged to him with a fascination Grant couldn't even put into words. "Perfect," Leon finally said, his voice still rough from recovery, though the smile stretching across Grant's face was unmistakably clear. "I've spent 10 years looking at you in newspapers, in case files, in the nightmares of my men. Now I look into a mirror and see you," Grant answered quietly. "You're seeing the shell. Don't confuse it with what's inside." Training began the very next morning. Grant taught Leon everything. The way he walked, strides measured and never hurried, because men in power never needed to rush. The way he spoke, voice low, slow, using few words because Grant believed people who talked too much usually had nothing worth saying. The way he sat during meetings, back never touching the chair, right hand always resting on the table, left hand on his thigh. The way he turned the Corsaro family ring around his ring finger whenever he was thinking, an unconscious habit Grant himself hadn't even realized existed until he found himself teaching another man to imitate it. Espresso at 6:15 every morning. No sugar, no cream, served in a white ceramic cup while standing at the kitchen window overlooking the grounds. And Leon learned all of it, faster than Grant liked. He didn't merely imitate, he absorbed, as though he were swallowing pieces of Grant into himself and digesting them into something that belonged to him alone. But the most dangerous part of the training wasn't the walking or the speaking. It was Lydia. Grant knew that if Leon failed to convince Lydia, the entire plan would collapse on the very first day. She was the woman who slept beside him every night, the woman who knew the sound of his breathing while he slept, the way his hand rested against the pillow, the way he turned over at 3 a.m. after nightmares he never spoke about. So Grant told him everything. He told him Lydia was afraid of thunder, that whenever storms rolled in, she curled into herself and he had to rest a hand against her back until it passed. He told him she twisted her hair around the index finger of her left hand whenever she was anxious, that she hated the smell of lilies because it reminded her of the funeral of a foster child she'd known when she was 10 years old. He told him the nickname he used for her was Little Bird, and that she only allowed him to call her that when they were alone. He told him the way she laughed when she was truly happy, not the polite laugh she gave the world, but the real one that started in her eyes before reaching her mouth, and the way she looked at him whenever she wanted to say she loved him but already knew he wouldn't say it back. So instead, she would rest her hand against his chest, over the scar beneath his left collarbone, and leave it there in silence. Grant shared all those things because he believed he was programming a puppet. He believed he was feeding information into a machine so the machine could follow the script correctly. What he didn't realize was that Leon wasn't listening the way a puppet listens to instructions. Leon listened the way a predator listens to the breathing of prey. Every detail Grant shared about Lydia, Leon didn't store inside a notebook. He stored inside instinct. She feared thunder, which meant she needed protection, which meant she would soften toward the person who made her feel safe. She twisted her hair when anxious, which meant she hid emotions through tiny gestures, which meant she was used to being overlooked, which meant attention itself would become the most powerful weapon. She placed her hand over the scar on Grant's chest, which meant she loved the human being inside him more than the crime boss, which meant if Leon offered her more of that humanity than Grant ever had, she wouldn't know which man was truly Grant anymore. And when Grant finished speaking, Leon looked at him through Grant's own face and said something Grant ignored in that moment, but would remember every night in the weeks that followed. "You know a lot about her, but I don't think you understand her." Grant called Conrad into the study that evening, closed the door behind him, and said he would be flying to Chicago within 2 weeks to handle a transportation expansion deal through the Great Lakes region, something he didn't want discussed over the phone. Conrad nodded without asking many questions. He simply said, "I'll handle everything here," in the voice of a man long accustomed to keeping the house standing whenever Grant disappeared for business, and Grant watched him nod and wondered whether what he was seeing was loyalty or relief. The next morning, Grant held Lydia at the front entrance of the estate. She adjusted the collar of his coat, a small habit she repeated every time he traveled, and softly said, "Call me." Grant answered, "Yeah," then stepped into the car. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that if he turned around, she would see something in his eyes he still wasn't ready for her to see. The car rolled through the estate gates and headed toward the highway, but not toward the airport. Warren drove directly to the hidden apartment Grant had prepared beforehand, a fourth-floor unit inside an aging apartment building in Mott Haven, the Bronx, registered under nobody's name, paid 6 months in cash, furnished with nothing more than a bed, a work desk, 3 monitors connected to hidden surveillance cameras throughout the estate, and a small refrigerator. This would be Grant's home for the coming weeks. And while Grant disappeared into a miserable apartment in the Bronx, Leon Hargrove stepped into his life. That afternoon, exactly at 4 o'clock, a black car stopped in front of the Long Island estate. Leon stepped out wearing Grant's gray suit, the Corsaro family ring on his ring finger, hair combed back in exactly the same style, shoes polished exactly the right way, walking with exactly the right rhythm, and looked up at the front of the mansion he would call home over the coming weeks, with the unmistakable eyes of a man returning to property he owned. He stepped through the front door. The living room stretched wide beneath high ceilings while afternoon sunlight poured through tall glass windows overlooking the gardens. Lydia sat, curled on the sofa, reading a book, knees folded beneath her, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the oversized sweater Grant knew she only wore when she was alone in the house. She looked up at the sound of the door, and her face passed through 2 quick expressions, surprise first, then happiness. "I thought you were going to Chicago?" Leon answered, without missing even a breath. "Plans changed. Deal got delayed, so I decided to handle it from here." His voice carried the exact tone, the exact pacing, the exact restrained style Grant always used whenever he didn't feel like explaining himself. Lydia smiled. Not a broad smile, but a soft one, the kind she gave whenever a small, unexpected joy found her. And she set the book aside, rose from the sofa, and walked over to kiss him gently on the cheek. "Good. I hate when you're away." Leon rested a hand against her waist, lightly, naturally, in precisely the place Grant always touched her, and answered, "I know." She didn't notice. There was nothing to notice. The face was right. The voice was right. The gestures were right. Even the cologne was right, because Leon had spent 3 weeks using Grant's bottle inside the Connecticut mansion. Everything was right. And Lydia Shaw, the woman who had lived beside Grant Corsaro for 3 years, the woman who had learned to read him through glances and silences, looked directly into the eyes of her fiancé's greatest enemy and saw the man she loved. But there was one person inside the estate Leon had not yet encountered. Betty Ann Price, 64 years old, housekeeper to the Corsaro family for more than 30 years. She had worked in this house since before Grant could walk, had carried him in her arms when he was 2 years old, and his father had been too busy running an empire to carry his own son, had been the only person permitted to enter the previous boss's bedroom without knocking, and when Grant's father died, she was the one who bathed him and dressed him for the final time before he was laid inside the coffin. Betty Ann knew this house the way people know their own bodies. She knew the sound of Grant's footsteps across the second-floor hardwood was different from everyone else's, heavier on the right heel because of the ankle injury he suffered at 19. She knew Grant always opened the study door with his right hand, always hung his coat on the 3rd hook from the left inside the hallway closet, always drank the first cup of coffee of the day with his right hand, before placing the cup down on the right side of the table, beside his chair, never the left. 30 years of watching a family not because it was her job, but because she had quietly come to think of this place as her family, even if nobody inside it had ever formally called her that. That evening, while Leon crossed through the dining room to pour himself a glass of water, Betty Ann was arranging napkins along the long dining table. She looked up, watched him walk past, and her eyes lingered. Not long, just one heartbeat longer than usual. A pause she wouldn't have been able to explain if anyone asked, because it wasn't something she understood with her mind. It was something she felt after 30 years inside this house. 30 years watching a small boy grow into a man. And now watching that man walk through the dining room while something she still couldn't name, no longer felt entirely right. During the first week, Leon Hargrove performed without a single mistake. On Monday morning, he sat at the head of the conference table on the second floor of the estate, while the 4 highest-ranking capos of the Corsaro family sat around him, and he conducted the weekly meeting exactly according to the script Grant had written before disappearing. The Newark port shipping routes remained on schedule. The 2 midtown Manhattan restaurants used for laundering money continued operating normally. Monthly payments to the police pipeline were transferred on time. Leon spoke with the correct tone, gave orders in the correct sequence, nodded at precisely the right moments, and when a capo named Vince asked about the progress of expansion into the Philadelphia territory, Leon answered, "Not yet. Wait until I finish the Chicago situation," with the same decisive restraint Grant had instructed him to use, brief and unexplained, because Grant Corsaro never explained his orders to anyone. The 4 capos left the room without a single one of them glancing back toward the chair at the head of the table with even the slightest suspicion. Conrad sat at the position to Leon's right, exactly where he always sat, and once the room emptied, he clapped Leon on the shoulder and said, "Handled clean, boss," wearing the satisfied smile of a lieutenant pleased that the machine was still running smoothly. Leon answered, "Yeah," then rose and walked out, knowing he had passed the first test. But with Lydia, Leon wasn't simply following the script, he was surpassing it. Tuesday night, Lydia cooked dinner in the kitchen, a simple pasta dish she usually made on ordinary evenings, and when she set the plate down on the table, Leon looked at her and quietly said, "Smells amazing." 2 words, just 2 words Grant had never once spoken. Grant would sit down, eat, nod if the meal was good, say nothing if it wasn't, and that was the full extent of the response Lydia had received after 3 years of cooking for him. Lydia looked at Grant 1 second longer than usual, then smiled softly. "Thank you," and inside her voice was something Leon heard more clearly than anyone else could have. Surprise. The surprise of someone unaccustomed to praise. Thursday night, Lydia sat reading on the sofa, while Leon lowered himself beside her instead of taking the opposite chair the way Grant normally did. He didn't speak. He simply sat closer than usual, and after several quiet minutes he rested his hand lightly against her knee, only the tips of his fingers, as though asking permission without needing words. Lydia looked at the hand, then looked at Grant, and confusion flickered openly through her eyes before she could hide it. Grant never touched her like that. Grant touched her while sleeping, when he unconsciously pulled her closer at 3 a.m, or when his hand rested against her back during thunderstorms. Grant touched her when he believed she needed protection. But this man touched her when nothing dangerous existed at all. When the night was calm, when she was simply reading a book, when she didn't need protection, but only needed to know somebody beside her actually saw her there. Saturday morning, Leon stood at the kitchen window drinking espresso at exactly 6:15, and when Lydia wandered downstairs, still half asleep, he turned toward her and said, "You're cute when you first wake up." Lydia stopped halfway down the staircase. She stood there for 2 full seconds, hair messy, eyes swollen with sleep, wearing an old nightshirt, staring at the man downstairs looking back at her with an expression she had never once seen on Grant's face. It wasn't the look of possession. It wasn't the look of control. It was attention. The look of someone truly seeing her, instead of looking through her toward something more important standing behind her. She smiled, the kind of smile that began in her eyes before reaching her mouth, exactly the kind Grant had once described to Leon, and she softly laughed. "You're strange today." Then she walked downstairs and poured herself coffee. But that night, lying awake in bed waiting for sleep, Lydia stared at the ceiling thinking about the past week. About the way Grant asked how her day had been when she came home from work. About the way he looked at her while she spoke, really looked at her instead of the usual look where his eyes were present but his mind was already inside the next meeting. About the way he touched her gently, not to hold her in place, but to say, "I'm here." She didn't understand why he had changed. She wasn't suspicious. She only felt something she didn't dare name, because naming it would mean admitting it had been missing for the last 3 years. She felt seen. And for Lydia Shaw, the little girl who grew up inside foster care, passed through 7 homes before turning 18, learned to cook for herself at 9 years old because nobody cooked for her, learned not to cry because crying in strangers' homes only made them send her away faster. Being seen was the most dangerous thing in the world, more dangerous than gunshots, more dangerous than blood on a shirt collar. Dangerous because it gave her the one thing she had hungered for her entire life. And once someone gives you the thing you've always hungered for, you stop asking questions about the person giving it to you. The second week began with a meeting Grant had never written into the script. Leon summoned the 4 capos early Monday morning, 30 minutes ahead of the usual schedule, and when they were all seated, he opened a file folder in the center of the table and said, "I want the Baltimore route reopened." The room went silent. Nobody inside the Corsaro family had spoken the words Baltimore route in 2 years, not since the day Grant personally ordered it shut down. The route wasn't for drugs or money laundering. It moved people, women and children, from Central America, through the port of Baltimore, and into the mainland, and Grant had shut it down not because it failed financially, but because it violated the one rule he established when he took power. Civilians were off limits. The Corsaro family smuggled goods, laundered money, loaned cash at crushing interest rates, controlled ports and underground casinos, but they did not traffic human beings. That was the line Grant drew in stone, and nobody crossed it. Vince, the capo overseeing Southern transport operations, looked at Grant with uncertain eyes. "Boss, you shut that route down 2 years ago. You said it would never reopen." Leon never blinked. "I know what I said. Now I'm saying something different. The market changed. That route pulls in $40 million a quarter, and we're letting it rot because of principles." Conrad sat on Leon's right, and the moment Leon finished speaking, he was the first one to answer. "I agree. $40 million a quarter isn't something we ignore. The market's open. Competitors will fill the space if we don't." Conrad spoke quickly and decisively, with the voice of a man who had wanted to say those words for a very long time, but never had the opportunity because the real Grant would never have allowed it. The 4 capos exchanged glances. Vince nodded slowly. 2 others followed. Only one man didn't nod. Warren Brecker stood against the wall in the corner of the room, arms crossed over his chest, looking at Grant with eyes that Leon might have recognized as defiance if he'd been more careful. "No," Warren said. Not loudly, not aggressively. Just one word, clear and sharp in the center of the room. Leon slowly turned toward him, the exact way Grant turned his head whenever somebody said something he didn't want to hear. "What did you just say?" "I said no. You shut that route down because it trafficked people. You said that was a line we don't cross. I was there when you said it. I don't understand why you want it reopened now." Leon rose from the table. He walked toward Warren slowly, step by deliberate step, stopping less than a foot away. He looked down at Warren, because inside Grant's body, Leon stood half a head taller, and he spoke in a low, measured voice, every word falling like stones into a well. "You questioning my orders?" Warren looked directly into Grant's eyes. He didn't step back, but he didn't speak again either, because Warren Brecker understood the rules of survival. Questioning the boss once took courage. Questioning him twice was suicide. And even though there was something in the eyes of the man standing before him that unsettled him deeply, Warren still believed this was Grant, still believed this was the same man who once drove across the city to sit beside him all night in a bar, while his PTSD nightmares returned. And Warren Brecker did not betray that man, so he stayed silent. Leon stared at him for 3 more seconds, before turning back toward the table. Meeting's over. That night, Warren walked into the parking lot behind the estate, climbed into his personal car, pulled out his phone, and dialed the private number Grant had given him before disappearing. A direct line meant only for emergencies. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, then voicemail. Warren called again. Same result. He sent a message. "Boss, call me. Urgent." No reply came. Warren sat alone inside the car for 10 full minutes, watching the screen slowly dim, and the unease he had swallowed during the meeting began rising back up inside him. Not fear, but something worse, the feeling that something was wrong without knowing exactly what. Inside the estate, Leon was doing something Grant had never anticipated. He was searching the study. Not for money, not for documents, for a phone. Grant had hidden a backup phone inside the estate, concealed beneath a false compartment under the 3rd drawer of the desk, reserved for emergency communication if the main line was compromised. Leon discovered it on the 9th night. Not because he knew where it was, but because Leon Hargrove was the kind of man who survived through suspicion, the kind who walked into a room and searched instinctively for anything that didn't belong there. Every unusual scratch in the wood, every drawer heavier than it should have been. He pulled out the phone, powered it on, saw no outgoing messages but found one single number stored in the contacts without a name attached. He kept the device completely powered down, removed the battery, and slipped the phone deep into his pocket. The following morning, he tossed the disabled phone into a storm drain outside the estate gates, while stepping out to collect the newspaper. Up in the fourth-floor apartment in Mott Haven, the Bronx, Grant sat before 3 surveillance monitors and watched everything happen. He watched Leon open a meeting that had never been part of the plan, watched him stand over Warren with a level of aggression Grant himself would never have used against the most loyal bodyguard he had ever known, watched Conrad support reopening the Baltimore route with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting years for this exact opportunity. The cameras carried no audio, only images, so Grant couldn't hear the conversation, but he could read body language. He could see the rigid tension in Warren's posture, the way Conrad leaned toward Leon, the way Leon dominated the room with an energy that existed nowhere in the script Grant had carefully written. Grant picked up the phone and dialed the emergency line hidden inside the estate. It rang. Nobody answered. He called again. The ringing stopped midway through the call, the unmistakable sound of somebody deliberately rejecting it rather than losing signal. He sent a message. Delivered. No reply. He called a third time. This time the number no longer existed. Grant slowly lowered the phone onto the desk. He stared at the 3 monitors in front of him, stared at the man wearing his face walking through his house, sitting at his table, speaking to his people. And for the first time since this plan began, Grant Corsaro understood that the puppet had cut its strings. The meeting took place inside a private seafood restaurant on City Island in the Bronx, a place the Corsaro family and the Albright family had used as neutral territory for 20 years, whenever the 2 sides needed to talk without guns resting on the table between them. But in all those 20 years, not a single meeting had ever ended with a handshake. Until tonight. Paxton Albright, 52 years old, silver streaks combed neatly through dark hair, wearing a charcoal cashmere jacket, sat at the head table inside the private upstairs room with 2 bodyguards standing behind him. He controlled the entire weapons smuggling network across the northeastern United States, from Maine down to Virginia, and the hatred between the Albright family and the Corsaro family went back to Grant's father. When both organizations fought over control of the port of Newark, a war that claimed 17 lives in 3 years before the 2 sides silently agreed to respect territorial boundaries. Leon entered the room with Conrad beside him. He shook Paxton's hand firmly with his right hand, the grip perfectly measured, eyes locked directly forward, then sat across from him and calmly said, "I want to talk business." Paxton looked at Grant Corsaro with the eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades fighting this family, and his smile came slowly but unmistakably. "Your father would roll in his grave if he knew you sat down here saying that sentence," Leon answered without missing a beat. "My father died holding on to grudges instead of making money. I'm not repeating the mistakes of dead men." Paxton studied Leon for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Talk." Leon presented the offer. 40% of Corsaro territory in the south, including the Baltimore route and 2 warehouses in Philadelphia, in exchange for military protection from the Albright side and access to their weapons pipeline for future operations. A deal the real Grant Corsaro would rather die than sign. Paxton knew that. Conrad knew that. And because of that, when Leon finished speaking and Paxton turned toward Conrad to read his reaction, what Conrad did in that single moment determined everything that followed afterward. Conrad didn't object. He didn't frown. He didn't look at Grant with shock or anger. He nodded, slightly, as though this was exactly what he had been expecting all along. Paxton saw that nod and understood immediately. The lieutenant supported the deal. The arrangement was legitimate. The 2 men shook hands. When they left the restaurant, Conrad and Leon rode together in the same car back toward Long Island. 10 minutes passed in silence. Then Conrad finally spoke, his voice low, eyes still fixed ahead. "You're not Grant." Leon didn't turn his head. He kept staring through the windshield into the night. "How long have you known?" "Since you reopened the Baltimore route, Grant would never reopen it. He'd lose $40 million a quarter before trafficking people. He's got that principle, that thing he calls the bottom line. I knew you weren't him because you don't have one." Silence settled between them. Then Leon quietly asked, "So why didn't you tell anyone?" Conrad looked out the window while the lights of New York slid past in long streaks across the glass. "Because I've been waiting for this chance for more than 25 years. I joined the Corsaro family at 16. Grant's father pulled me off the streets, fed me, gave me a place to live, gave me work, but he never gave me the thing I wanted most. What was that? To be called by my real name, to be seen, to sit at the head of the table instead of always sitting at the right side of it. Leon turned and looked at Conrad for the first time during the conversation. So we have a deal? Conrad answered without hesitation. You keep the face. I keep the power behind it. We split this empire the way it should have been split a long time ago. They shook hands there inside the car, in the middle of the night, speeding along the Long Island Expressway, and from that moment forward, Leon Hargrove was no longer a puppet. He was a partner. Up in the fourth-floor apartment in Mott Haven, Grant saw none of the meeting with Paxton because it happened outside the estate, beyond the reach of his cameras. He also heard nothing of the conversation between Leon and Conrad inside the car. What he did see that night, through the central kitchen camera inside the estate, was Lydia. She was cooking. Leon stood beside her in the kitchen, leaning against the marble counter with a glass of wine in his hand, watching her cook, and Lydia was singing, softly, almost beneath her breath, a song Grant recognized instantly because she had sung it only once before, the first night she ever stayed at his house. The following morning she stood in the kitchen cooking eggs and quietly singing while believing he was still asleep upstairs. Grant had remained lying in bed listening without coming downstairs because he was afraid if he appeared she would stop singing, and he wanted to hear more. But afterward she never sang again, not once in 3 years. And now she was singing. In the kitchen, beside the man wearing his face, Grant sat in the darkness, the only light coming from the 3 monitors in front of him, and watched Lydia sing beside Leon. He watched her lean toward Leon while laughing, watched her hand him a spoon to taste the food, watched Leon say something that made her smile, the kind of smile that began in her eyes before reaching her mouth, the exact smile Grant himself had described to Leon in painstaking detail 3 weeks earlier inside the Connecticut mansion. Grant turned the monitors off, not because he was angry. He turned them off because he couldn't keep watching without finally confronting a question he had spent 3 years avoiding. He had built walls around Lydia, walls made of money, bodyguards, mansions, power. He protected her from enemies, from the streets, from her past, from every danger outside that could possibly hurt her. But he never asked how her day had been, never complimented her cooking, never sat beside her on the sofa simply because he wanted to be close to her, never looked at her with the eyes of someone truly seeing her instead of checking whether she was safe. He protected her from the entire world. But who protected her from him? From the emptiness he created by loving her like something to be guarded, instead of someone who needed to be seen? Grant sat alone in the dark apartment, and for the first time in his life, the pain he felt wasn't because somebody had taken something from him. It was because the thing he lost was something he had never truly possessed at all. Betty Ann Price realized it on a Wednesday morning in the kitchen at exactly 6:12. She had been awake since 5:30, just as she had every day for the past 30 years, preparing the kitchen, wiping down the marble counters, arranging the cups, setting the espresso machine so that when Grant came downstairs at 6:15, everything would already be waiting for him. She knew this routine, the way she knew the rhythm of her own breathing. Grant came downstairs, walked directly to the machine, poured espresso into a white porcelain cup, then stood by the kitchen window looking out at the yard while drinking it. Right hand holding the cup, always the right hand. 30 years, ever since he was a 10-year-old boy drinking hot milk at this very kitchen table, always the right hand. But this morning, when Leon walked downstairs at exactly 6:15, poured espresso into the correct cup, walked to the correct window, stood in the correct spot, he held the cup in his left hand. Betty Ann was wiping the counter behind him, her eyes not directly on him, but she saw it anyway, because 30 years inside this house had turned her eyes into the kind that didn't need to stare directly at something in order to see it. Her hand stopped moving for 1 second, then continued wiping. She said nothing at that moment. She waited until noon, when Leon sat alone at the dining table eating lunch. Lydia out of the house, the estate quiet, and Betty Ann carried a plate to him and set it down in front of him. She placed the plate on the table, then remained standing there 1 beat longer than usual. "Boss," she said calmly, the same voice she used whenever reminding Grant to wear a coat in cold weather or not drink alcohol on an empty stomach. "You switched hands when you drink your coffee." Leon looked up at her. He didn't blink. "What?" "This morning, you held the cup with your left hand. You always use your right." Silence. Leon stared at Betty Ann, and in that moment she saw something 30 years serving the Corsaro family had taught her to recognize instantly: calculation. Not the surprise of a man caught in an unconscious habit. The calculation of a man deciding how dangerous she might be. Leon smiled. "You're getting old, Betty. Bad memory comes with age." He spoke lightly, warmly, the same kind of teasing Grant used with older people. But underneath that warmth was something Betty Ann heard as clearly as church bells on Sunday morning. A warning. She nodded slowly. "Guess I am old." Then she turned away, walked out of the dining room, and never mentioned left hands or right hands again. But that night at 11 o'clock, after the entire estate had gone dark, Betty Ann sat inside her room on the first floor, the small room behind the kitchen where she had slept for 3 decades, and opened the drawer of her bedside table. Inside lay a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. On it was a phone number. Grant's father had given her that number 20 years earlier and said, "If something ever happens in this house and you can't trust anyone, call this number." She had never called it. 20 years. Through difficult nights, through the death of Grant's father, through the years Grant rose to power, she had never once needed it. But tonight, she unfolded the paper, stared at the number, then walked into the living room where the old landline phone still sat because she stubbornly refused to throw it away even after the entire household switched to cell phones years ago. She picked up the receiver and dialed. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Nobody answered. She waited until voicemail picked up, then spoke in a low, steady, deliberate voice. "Mr. Grant, there's a stranger inside your house." Then she hung up, folded the paper again, returned it to the drawer, went to bed. She never knew that the secret number she dialed belonged to the personal private phone Grant always kept with him, now sitting on the desk inside his Bronx apartment. Because Grant was intensely focused on the surveillance monitors, with his device set to silent, the call slipped straight into voicemail, leaving her desperate warning completely unheard until it was too late. Grant remained blind to the impending tragedy, unaware that Leon had already cut the power to the basement camera feed to bury his tracks in the dark. The very next morning, Lydia woke early and noticed Betty Ann's bedroom door standing open. Betty Ann wasn't inside. Lydia called for her in the kitchen, outside in the yard, then walked downstairs into the basement, where Betty Ann often checked the storage rooms. She found her at the bottom of the basement staircase, eyes closed, neck bent at an angle. Lydia recognized instantly from years as a nurse, as incompatible with life. Lydia collapsed to her knees beside her, pressing 2 fingers against Betty Ann's wrist, searching for a pulse even though she already knew there wouldn't be one, and only then did she finally allow herself to cry. Police arrived, took statements, reached their conclusion. Fall down the stairs, head trauma, 64-year-old woman, steep staircase, tragic but not unusual. Nobody asked questions. The funeral took place 3 days later, at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, small and quiet, attended only by family insiders. Leon stood before the coffin delivering the eulogy. He spoke about Betty Ann in a perfectly strained voice, about 30 years of service, about loyalty, about how she had been the silent backbone of the household. He paused at exactly the right moments, breathed at exactly the right rhythm, allowed one tear to fall at precisely the correct time. Lydia stood beside him, eyes red, hands gripping a bouquet of white flowers, leaning against Grant because she needed somebody to lean on, and the man beside her rested his hand against her back exactly the way Grant always did. And she cried into his chest without knowing she was crying against the chest of the man who murdered the very woman she mourned. 400 meters away beyond a row of maple trees already beginning to turn color, Grant Corsaro stood watching. Dark coat, hat pulled low, far enough away that nobody would recognize him, close enough to see the oak coffin, the white flowers, Lydia crying, Leon's hand resting on her back, and Betty Ann, the woman who held him when his father never did, who cooked for him after his mother walked away, who remained the only person alive still allowed to call him boy, even after he became boss, now lying inside a coffin because she dared to speak one honest sentence inside a house full of lies. Grant's hand shook, not from the cold. His hands didn't shake when he was shot, didn't shake when he killed people, didn't shake sitting across from enemies inside abandoned warehouses in Newark. His hand shook because Betty Ann Price died because of him, because of his plan, because he brought a wolf into the house and walked away, leaving a 64-year-old woman alone to recognize the wolf first. Warren stood beside him in silence, waiting. "He killed her," Warren finally said, not as a question because both men already knew Betty Ann wasn't the kind of woman who fell downstairs. Grant stared at the coffin one last time. I know. After Betty Ann's funeral, Grant knew he couldn't act alone anymore. He needed Warren, but Warren was still inside the estate, still taking orders from Leon, still believing the man sitting at the head of the table every morning was Grant Corsaro, even though every instinct left in him from his years as a Marine had been screaming since the second week that something wasn't right. Grant sent a message to Warren's private number through a prepaid phone bought with cash at a corner store in Harlem. The message contained only one line. Red Hook, Pier 7, midnight, come alone, no signature. But Pier 7 was a code only Grant and Warren knew, born from a night 5 years earlier when the two of them had to deal with a compromised shipment at Red Hook at 3 a.m. without anyone else finding out. Midnight. Red Hook waterfront, Brooklyn. Wind rolled off Upper Bay carrying salt and engine oil between stacks of shipping containers disappearing into darkness. Grant arrived first. He stood in the corner of Pier 7 wearing a dark coat, hat pulled low, beard grown longer than usual after 3 weeks without shaving, looking less like the boss of half the East Coast and more like a homeless man hiding from the wind at the docks. Warren arrived exactly on time. He stepped into the weak circle of light cast by the dock lamp, saw Grant, and his first reaction wasn't recognition. It was drawing his gun, because Warren had left the estate 2 hours earlier and had seen Grant sitting in the first-floor study at 10 that night, and now Grant was standing at Red Hook wearing a dirty coat. Two men with the same face couldn't exist at once unless one of them was fake, and Warren Brecker had been trained to shoot first and ask later. Don't move, hands up, Warren said. Glock aimed directly at Grant's chest, voice steady but sharp with caution. Who are you? Grant stayed still, slowly raised his hands to shoulder height. Flint, he said, using the nickname only Grant ever called Warren, a nickname born the first night Warren worked for the family, when Grant watched him light a Zippo with one hand and said, You're quick as Flint. But the nickname wasn't enough. Plenty of people inside the family knew Grant called Warren Flint. Not enough. Prove it. Grant looked at Warren through the barrel of the gun. He didn't talk about business, didn't mention the family, didn't say anything another person might know. He talked about a Thursday night 3 years earlier, 3 a.m. You called me from O'Malley's in Hell's Kitchen. You didn't say anything, just called and hung up. I knew what that meant, because it was the third time you'd done it. Nightmares. PTSD. This one was worse than the first two because you'd already finished half a bottle of bourbon before calling. Warren didn't lower the gun, but his finger loosened slightly on the trigger. I drove over, Grant continued. You were sitting at the end of the bar, eyes red, hands shaking. You looked at me like I was the only person left in the world you trusted. I sat beside you. Didn't ask questions, didn't talk, just sat there. You drank 2 more glasses. I drank water. Around 5 a.m, you dropped your head onto the bar. I carried you to the car, drove you home to Astoria, put you in bed, left a bottle of water and 2 aspirin on the nightstand, started walking out. Grant stopped. But before I left, you said something. You were almost asleep, so maybe you don't remember saying it, but I remember. Warren stared at him, gun still raised, but lower now by 20 degrees. What did I say? Grant answered quietly. You said, thanks for not asking. Silence. Wind moved across the harbor carrying the metallic clank of container chains somewhere in the dark. Warren lowered the gun, slowly, returned it to the shoulder holster, then looked at Grant with the eyes of a man who had just understood something enormous and was trying to force it into a shape his mind could survive. Who's the one in the estate? Grant told him, briefly, not one unnecessary word. Leon Hargrove. Surgery. Duplicate. Plan. Mistake. Lost control. Conrad involved. Betty Ann dead because she noticed. Warren listened, turned away toward the water for 10 seconds, then looked back. What do you need? Proof. Conrad is the key. I need to know why he betrayed me. And where do you think we'll find it? My father's warehouse. Staten Island. The warehouse stood in the industrial district of southwestern Staten Island, a 2-story red brick building. Grant's father had purchased 50 years earlier through a shell company and used to store files. He never wanted anyone to find. After his father died, Grant locked it and never returned once in 8 years because that warehouse belonged to his father's time and Grant wasn't the kind of man who lived in the past. They arrived at 2 a.m. Warren broke the gate lock. Grant forced the front door. Inside, everything remained untouched from 8 years earlier. dust covering every surface, damp air, flashlights sweeping across rows of old file shelves lining the walls. The safe was upstairs inside Grant's father's office, hidden behind a large photograph of the Port of Newark from 1978. Grant opened it with the combination his father had given him before dying, the only thing passed down verbally and written nowhere else. Inside were 3 items: an old pistol, a thick envelope of cash, and a brown file folder. Grant opened the folder. Inside were a birth certificate, DNA test results, and a handwritten letter. The birth certificate carried the name Conrad Tate, but in the section marked Father was written Grant's father's name. The DNA report confirmed it. Conrad Tate was biological family. The handwritten letter, written in Grant's father's fading ink across yellowing paper, remained painfully clear. Conrad, you are my son. I knew that before you walked into this house at 16. Your mother was the woman I loved before I met Grant's mother, but I didn't have the courage to acknowledge you in front of my wife, in front of the family, in front of the world. I brought you into this house as an outsider so you could stay close to me, but I never gave you what you deserved to receive. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. I hope one day you forgive me. The letter carried no date, no stamped envelope. It had never been sent. Grant sat on the dusty warehouse floor holding the letter and understood why Conrad stayed with the family since his youth without leaving. Understood why Conrad always worked harder than everyone else, but never asked for anything. Understood why Conrad looked at Grant with an expression Grant had always mistaken for loyalty, when in truth, it was something far more complicated. The expression of a brother watching another brother be acknowledged, be named, be crowned. While he stood beside him for all those years and was never once called son, Conrad hadn't betrayed him for power. Conrad betrayed him because for his entire adult life, he had been denied identity inside his own blood family. And the most painful thing wasn't the betrayal. It was the letter in Grant's hands proving that his father knew, regretted it, wrote the apology, but never found enough courage to send it. Grant folded the letter, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, and stood. Warren remained at the doorway watching him. Find anything? Grant walked past him without stopping. A reason. Over the following week, Grant watched from a distance as the empire he had spent 8 years building was dismantled piece by piece. Through the remaining surveillance system inside the estate, he watched Leon sit at the head of the table and sign a thick stack of documents Conrad placed in front of him, page after page. With the signature Leon had practiced for 3 weeks inside the Connecticut mansion, until it was almost impossible to distinguish from the real one. 40% of the Corsaro family's southern territory, including the Baltimore port route, 2 warehouses in Philadelphia, and control over 3 land routes running from New Jersey down to Virginia, was transferred to Paxton Albright in exchange for military protection and access to the weapons network. Conrad stood at Leon's right while he signed, and in that moment, on the silent camera feed, Grant saw Conrad smile. Not a wide smile, just a slight curve at the corner of his mouth. The smile of a man who had just placed the final piece on the board and knew he had won. The 4 senior capos nodded their approval. Nobody objected. Warren wasn't present at that meeting because Leon had sent him to handle a shipment at the Port of Newark that very day, a coincidence both Grant and Warren knew wasn't a coincidence at all. From the Bronx apartment, Grant took inventory. Personal accounts, frozen because Leon had changed the bank access codes using signature authority. Communication network, reduced to Warren and 1 prepaid phone. Identity, split between 2 men wearing the same face, while the man inside the estate had the ring, the signature, the lieutenant's confirmation, and 200 soldiers obeying his commands. And Grant had a miserable apartment, an old letter, and the clothes on his back. Grant Corsaro, the boss who once controlled an empire from the Port of Newark to the private rooms of Manhattan, now stood outside his own life like a ghost no one would believe was real. The mistake happened on Thursday night. Grant needed food. The apartment refrigerator had been empty for 2 days, and Warren was at the Port of Newark and couldn't bring supplies. Grant pulled his hat low, wore an old coat, and walked 4 blocks to a small grocery store on Willis Avenue. On his way back, he passed Donovan's, a bar on the corner of East 149th Street that the Corsaro family had used as a minor exchange point for 10 years. He didn't mean to stop, but the bar door opened, and a young man stepped out, 25 or 26, leather jacket, slicked back hair, quick eyes, the kind of low-level soldier whose name Grant couldn't remember but whose face was familiar because he'd seen him at an expanded meeting a few months earlier. The young man looked at Grant, stopped. His eyes widened slightly. The look of someone recognizing the boss's face, but not the clothes, not the setting, not why Grant Corsaro would be walking alone on Willis Avenue at 10 o'clock at night carrying grocery bags. "Boss?" he said uncertainly. Grant didn't stop. He kept walking, faster now, head lowered. "Hey, boss, Mr. Corsaro." The young man followed. Grant turned into an alley and picked up speed. The soldier stopped at the alley entrance, watched him go, then pulled out his phone. Grant heard him making the call when he was already 30 meters away, the young man's voice echoing down the dark alley. "Brother, I just saw the boss in Mott Haven, walking alone, dressed weird as hell." On the other end of the line, Leon answered. He was sitting in the estate living room, feet propped on the table, while Lydia sat curled at the far end of the sofa reading a book. He listened until the young soldier finished, then replied calmly, "I'm at home. You saw wrong, or some man who looks like me. But just to be safe, call 2 more guys. Find him. Bring him here. If he fights back, handle it." Leon hung up and looked over at Lydia. "Who was that?" she asked without lifting her eyes from the book. "A soldier mistook somebody for me." "Nothing." In the alley off Willis Avenue, Grant heard footsteps behind him. Not 1 man, but 2, then 3. The young soldier had called reinforcements faster than Grant expected, or there had already been men inside the bar. Grant dropped the grocery bag and ran, not like a boss, like a hunted man, cutting through the dark alley, climbing a metal fence, ducking beneath a fire escape, running until the footsteps behind him vanished, and he finally braced his back against a damp brick wall in a dead-end alley near the subway station, breathing hard, sweat running down his face, with nothing left in his coat pocket but the prepaid phone and his father's letter. Grant Corsaro, the man half the East Coast once bowed before, stood in a Bronx alley at 10 o'clock at night, hunted by his own soldiers. Not a single dollar in his pocket, not 1 ally within reach, and his face had become the most dangerous thing he carried, because it looked exactly like the face of the man who had just ordered him captured. That night the estate was quieter than usual. No rain, no wind. Only the hallway clock on the 2nd floor, counting off each second with the same patient rhythm Lydia had listened to for 3 years, sleeping in this house. Leon lay beside her, already asleep, breathing evenly, face turned toward her, and in the darkness, that face was still Grant's face. The same lines, the same jaw, the same nose. Lydia lay on her back, staring at the ceiling for several minutes, before turning onto her side toward him, as she did every night, and placing her hand against his chest. This was her habit. Every night before sleeping, she rested her hand on Grant's chest just beneath his left collarbone, where there was a small scar no longer than 3 centimeters. She touched that scar the way people touch a lucky charm, a quiet ritual reminding her that the man beside her wasn't only a Mafia boss, but also the 15-year-old boy who once got into a fight over a stray cat. That scar was the part of Grant she loved most, the human being beneath all the armor, and she touched it every night because that was how she said she loved him without opening her mouth. Her fingertips touched his chest. Warm skin. Smooth. She stopped. Her fingers moved slightly left, thinking maybe she'd missed the spot. Still smooth. To the right. Smooth. She used her whole hand and slowly traced beneath the collarbone from side to side, lightly enough that the man beside her didn't move. Nothing. No scar. Skin smooth like somebody who had never been injured there at all. Lydia's heart sped up. 1 beat. 2. 3. She kept her hand where it was. Didn't pull away because pulling away suddenly created movement. Movement created vibration. Vibration might wake the man beside her, and if the man beside her wasn't Grant, then waking him now meant death. Lydia Shaw, 27 years old, had learned one lesson before almost every other lesson in life. When you are lying in bed inside a stranger's house and the stranger is dangerous, you don't run, you don't scream, you don't breathe harder. You pretend to sleep. You pretend until morning comes, and you find the door out. Foster care taught her that when she was 7 years old, in the second house, when her foster father drank and opened her bedroom door at midnight, she pretended to sleep that night, and the next night, and the next, until a social worker moved her somewhere else. Now, 20 years later, she used that exact same skill again. She left her hand resting on his chest, closed her eyes, slowed her breathing into the rhythm of deep sleep, and she lay there until morning beside a stranger wearing the face of the man she loved, without sleeping for even 1 minute. The next morning, Lydia performed perfectly. She woke at the usual time, went downstairs, cooked eggs, poured coffee, kissed Grant on the cheek when he sat at the table, and asked, "Sleep well?" In such an ordinary voice, she surprised herself with how ordinary it sounded. Leon answered, "Yeah," then drank coffee with his left hand. And Lydia looked at that left hand, looked at that coffee cup, and now she saw everything she had ignored before, because she had never had a reason to look. Left hand holding the cup. Grant used his right. The way he sat at the table leaning into the chair instead of sitting straight. Grant never leaned back. The way he cut food, setting down knife and fork halfway through instead of cutting everything first. Grant always finished cutting before eating. A habit from childhood when his mother taught him table manners at 4 years old. Every tiny detail now rang like alarm bells, but Lydia never let any of it appear on her face. She ate breakfast, washed dishes, kissed him again before he went to the study, then waited. She waited until noon, when Leon left to meet Conrad upstairs, then walked into his study. Fast, precise. She opened the desk drawers and searched, not even knowing what she was looking for until she found it. In the last drawer, beneath stacks of paperwork, there was a small notebook. On the final page, written in pencil, was a sequence of numbers without notes or names. Lydia copied the number onto her palm with a ballpoint pen and returned everything exactly where it belonged. That afternoon, she told Leon she needed to buy supplies. He nodded without looking up. She drove to a laundromat in Jackson Heights, Queens, where there was an old public payphone on the corner that she remembered from before she met Grant, when she still lived alone and did her own laundry there. She picked up the receiver, dropped coins in, dialed the number from her palm. 2 rings. "Who is this?" Warren's voice. She recognized him instantly, because Warren was the only person alive who answered phones with those 2 words, instead of saying hello like a normal human being. "Warren, it's Lydia." Silence for 1 second. "Lydia, where are you calling from?" "Payphone." "Listen to me. The man in my house isn't Grant." Longer silence. Then Warren spoke, and his voice changed. "How long have you known?" "Last night. He doesn't have the scar." Silence. Then a third voice on the line. "Grant." "Lydia." She closed her eyes when she heard him. The real voice. Not a copy. Not rehearsed. The voice of the man who stood in the rain 7 nights outside the hospital in Brooklyn because he didn't know any other way to tell her he wanted to be close to her. She wanted to cry. She didn't cry. "Be quiet," she said. "Listen to me. I know you're out there. I know you can't come back yet. I'm staying in the house with him. I'm going to pretend I don't know. You need time. I'll buy time for you." "No, too dangerous." "He killed Betty Ann because she noticed." "I know. I also know if I run now, he'll know. And he'll know somebody out there told me. Then both of us die." Grant stayed silent. Lydia could hear him breathing through the phone. Heavy breathing. The breathing of a man holding something enormous inside himself. "You brought the enemy into our house," she said. Her voice didn't shake, wasn't angry, just truth. "Into our bed. Then you disappeared without saying a word. I'm staying not because you told me to. I'm staying because if I leave now, nobody lives long enough to fix this. You don't get to decide what's dangerous for me anymore." A long silence. Then Grant spoke, quieter than she had ever heard him, smaller somehow. "I'm sorry." Lydia closed her eyes tighter, gripped the receiver. "Apologize later. Stay alive first." She hung up. Stood inside the laundromat for 30 more seconds watching washing machines turn behind the glass, then wiped the numbers from her palm clean, walked outside, and drove back to the Long Island estate. She stepped inside and found Leon sitting in the living room, reading the newspaper. She smiled. "I bought ice cream for you. Pistachio, right?" Leon smiled back. "You know me too well." She turned and walked into the kitchen, and the smile disappeared from her face as though it had never existed at all. From the day she made that call at the Queen's laundromat, Lydia Shaw became someone she'd never imagined she would become. A spy inside her own home. She performed every day, every hour, every minute, smiling at the right time, kissing in the right place, cooking the right meals, sitting beside Leon on the sofa every night and resting her head on his shoulder while watching movies, while inside her mind she memorized every call he took, every name he mentioned, every time he stepped into the study and closed the door. Step 1. Recording. She bought a tiny recorder, no bigger than the tip of her finger, from an electronics store in Flushing. Paid in cash. Didn't use a card. She hid it inside the fake flower pot on the bookshelf in the study, where Leon often called Conrad behind a closed door. After 3 days, she removed it and listened. Leon's voice and Conrad's discussed the Baltimore route, delivery schedules with Paxton Albright's men, the redistribution of profits from the Philadelphia warehouses. Every detail she heard was proof that the Corsaro empire was being sold piece by 2 men, one wearing the owner's face and the other stabbing that owner in the back after a lifetime of standing beside him. Step 2. The signature. Leon signed papers every day. Contracts, transfer orders, internal agreements, and his signature was nearly perfect, but nearly wasn't perfect. Lydia knew this because she had something Leon never expected her to have: the handwritten wedding card Grant had given her 6 months before proposing. Not a printed card. Grant had written it himself, in black ink on cream-colored paper. Just 2 lines. "I'm not good at talking, but if you can stand me, I'll be here every day until you make me leave." And he had signed his name beneath it. Lydia kept that card in the hidden bottom of her jewelry box because it was the only thing Grant had ever written to her by hand, and she would keep it until the day she died. She took the card out, set it beside a document Leon had just signed on the study desk, and photographed them both with her phone. Leon's signature was missing the tiny downward stroke at the end of the C in Corsaro, the one Grant always dragged below the line. Hard to see with the naked eye, but side by side, undeniable. Step 3. Medication. Lydia cleaned the master bathroom every week, a habit from when Betty Ann was still alive, because the old housekeeper had taught her that keeping house wasn't a servant's duty but a way of showing this house was hers too. While cleaning the cabinet beneath the sink, she found a small prescription bottle hidden behind rows of towels. The label had been peeled off, but Lydia recognized the pills. High-dose Celebrex, prescribed for patients after major cosmetic surgery to reduce swelling and inflammation. She knew because she was a nurse, and she had seen that medication hundreds of times in the hospital. Grant Corsaro had never had cosmetic surgery. She photographed the bottle, returned it to the exact same place, and added another piece to the picture she was building inside her mind. This man wasn't only not Grant, he had recently undergone major surgery to change his face. Then Colette came home, Grant's younger sister, 24 years old, with the same dark brown hair as her brother. Bright eyes, quick laughter, still carrying the energy of someone the underworld hadn't touched, because Grant had sent her to Paris to study when she was 18, so she would never have to know how he made his money. She flew home because the annual family anniversary celebration was coming, and she called Grant from Charles de Gaulle Airport before boarding, saying, "I'm coming home, big brother," in the delighted voice of a child returning where she belonged. Leon picked her up at JFK. Colette walked through the gate, saw her brother, and ran to hug him tightly. Leon hugged her back with the right rhythm, the right pressure, patting her back twice the way Grant always did. On the ride home, Colette sat in the back seat talking nonstop about Paris, about class, about a tiny cafe in Montmartre she had become addicted to, then suddenly stopped mid-sentence and said, "Hey, do you remember the song Mom used to sing to us? I heard it again on the plane and cried the whole time." Leon didn't turn around. He was driving, eyes forward, and for 1 second, just 1 second, his hands tightened on the steering wheel. Grant had never told Leon about their mother's song. It wasn't in the script. It wasn't part of the 3 weeks of training. "Of course I remember," Leon answered in a warm, natural voice, the voice of an older brother speaking to his little sister. "It's a good song." Colette looked at him from the back seat, silent for half a second. Then she laughed. "You think it's good? When we were kids, you hated that song. You said Mom was always singing off beat." Leon laughed with her. "People grow up. They change." Colette accepted the answer because she had no reason not to accept it. But Lydia, sitting in the passenger seat, heard the entire exchange and realized 2 things. First, Leon didn't know the song. Second, Colette was a danger. Innocent, talkative, full of questions, and she would keep asking questions Leon had no answers to. If she asked the wrong one at the wrong time, Leon would handle her the only way he knew how, the way he had handled Betty Ann. Lydia couldn't let that happen. From that day on, she stayed close to Colette, inviting her shopping, asking her to cook together, keeping her near and as far from Leon as possible, using the natural warmth of a future sister-in-law that Colette never questioned except to think, "Lydia's so sweet lately." The following week, Lydia called Warren from another payphone in Astoria. Warren connected her to Grant. She spoke quickly and clearly. The family anniversary celebration, 2 weeks from now, 200 people. Every capo, soldier, and ally will be there. This is our only chance. Grant listened in silence. I'll create a situation that forces him to reveal himself in front of everyone. You appear at that exact moment. Bring your father's letter. Bring the evidence. End this. And if it fails? Grant asked. Lydia didn't hesitate. Then we die in the place where we lived. Better than dying in the dark. The Long Island estate was lit from 6 in the evening. 200 people. Men in black suits, women in evening gowns, red wine glowing in crystal glasses, chandeliers spilling light across marble floors that Betty Ann had once polished every morning for 30 years. The Corsaro family anniversary celebration. An annual tradition where every capo, soldier, and ally gathered under one roof to remind themselves they belonged to the same organization, the same bloodline of power. Leon stood in the center of the ballroom, flawless in a black 3-button suit, the Corsaro family ring gleaming on his ring finger, shaking hands with everyone using a firm right hand, calling each capo by name in the correct order, smiling at the right moments, turning serious at the right moments, and anyone looking at him tonight would see Grant Corsaro at the peak of his power. Conrad stood at his right side as always, eyes moving across the room, controlling everything with the precision of a man who knew tonight had to be perfect. Because tonight, the Corsaro family officially entered a new chapter, under leadership nobody knew was counterfeit. Lydia wore a long black dress, her hair pinned up, the platinum necklace Grant had given her on the day of their engagement around her neck, and she moved through the room with a calmness no one else possessed. Not calm because she wasn't afraid, calm because she had already been afraid enough. 5 weeks living beside a man wearing her lover's face. 5 weeks performing smiles, tears, kisses. 5 weeks sleeping beside a murderer every night and pretending to sleep. Fear had burned itself empty. What remained was resolve. 9 o'clock. Dinner ended. Leon stood and raised his glass, delivering a short speech about family, legacy, and the future, in a voice full of confidence that earned applause from the entire room. Then Lydia stood. She walked toward the microphone at the head of the table, and the room grew quiet because tradition said the boss's fiancé or wife always spoke after the boss, a small ritual everyone treated as ceremony. But Lydia knew tonight wouldn't be ceremony. She looked at the 200 faces before her, then looked at Leon, then smiled. I want to say a few words about the man I'm going to marry. Soft laughter spread through the room. Warm. Most people here know Grant Corsaro as the boss, the man who gives orders, the man who walks into a room and the room goes silent. She paused, but I know a different Grant. The Grant I know was a 15-year-old boy with no family empire, no power, nothing except his fists and his pride. And that boy once got into a fight with 3 boys 2 years older than him, not over territory, not over money. Her smile deepened. Over a stray cat. The room laughed louder. A few voices called out, "No way. Seriously?" Leon laughed too, perfectly timed, perfectly measured. That fight left a small scar just beneath his left collarbone. I touch that scar every night. It reminds me that underneath everything all of you see, there's a real person. She looked directly into Leon's eyes. Honey, show them. Show them the stray cat scar. The room erupted in whistles and laughter. 200 people looked at Grant with amused expectation. Leon smiled broadly and shook his head in mock embarrassment. You're embarrassing me. Since when do you get embarrassed? Lydia smiled sweetly, but her eyes never left his for even 1 second. Take off your jacket. 2 buttons. That's all. The room laughed harder. Someone from the back shouted, Take it off, boss. Leon kept smiling, but his hands didn't move to his collar. He lifted his wine glass instead, took a sip, and said, Save that for the honeymoon, in a joking tone that pulled more laughter from the crowd. But Lydia didn't laugh. She tilted her head, her voice softer now, gentler, but every word landed with the precision of a scalpel. I'm serious. That scar is my favorite thing about you. I want everyone to see it. For me. Conrad stood up, fast, chair scraping backward. Come on, Lydia. Let him breathe. It's a party. And exactly when Conrad stood, exactly when the room started sensing something wrong in Lydia's insistence and Grant's refusal, the side door at the back of the ballroom opened. the service hallway door, the one only staff used. Grant Corsaro walked in. Not through the front entrance. He entered through the servant's door, wearing a white dress shirt with the collar deeply unbuttoned, openly exposing the jagged 4-centimeter scar beneath his left collarbone, the exact mark of the stray cat fight that Lydia had just challenged the imposter to reveal. In his left hand, he carried a yellowed letter. The room didn't recognize it immediately. 2 seconds. 3. Then the first person saw him, a capo seated near the side entrance. He looked at Grant, then at Leon at the head table, then back at Grant, and the wine glass in his hand froze halfway to his mouth. Then the second person saw, then the third, then the fourth. Like a wave moving through water, faces turned toward the back door and then toward the head table. And the sound in the room didn't disappear. It died, layer by layer. Laughter stopped, conversation stopped, glasses stopped clinking, until 200 people stood in complete silence, staring at 2 men with the same face at opposite ends of the room. Grant walked forward, not quickly, each step steady across the marble floor. He looked at Leon. Leon looked at him. 2 identical faces standing before 200 witnesses, and in that moment the entire room understood that everything they believed for 5 weeks was collapsing. Grant spoke. Not loudly. He didn't need to. 200 people were holding their breath. 8 years ago, my father was killed in the warehouse on Staten Island. Everyone believed it was the Albright family. He turned his eyes toward Conrad. It wasn't. He looked directly at him. Conrad Tate arranged it. Not for power. Because my father had another son he never had the courage to claim. Grant lifted the letter. This is the letter my father wrote to Conrad. He called him son. He apologized. He never sent it. Conrad stood abruptly, face drained white, mouth open but no sound coming out, because a decades-old secret had just been spoken aloud in front of 200 people. Leon stood at the head table, his hand moving slowly toward his back, where the pistol sat tucked into his waistband. But he hadn't drawn it yet. The room froze. Nobody knew who was real and who was fake. Then Lydia stepped forward. She stood between the 2 men carrying the same face, and looked at Grant. Only Grant. "The song your mother used to sing to you when you were little?" she said, calm voice. But for the first time in 5 weeks, her eyes weren't performing. "Sing it." Grant looked at her. He didn't sing. He hated singing. His mother left when he was 12, and that song was the only thing she left behind. An old lullaby she sang off rhythm every night, until the night she wasn't there anymore. He opened his mouth. The melody came out trembling, off-beat, his voice cracking on the high notes, exactly the way his mother used to sing because he had been singing it like her his whole life without realizing it. The singing was bad, broken, and more beautiful than every speech made in that room. Colette burst into tears immediately. Not quiet tears, full body sobbing, shoulders shaking, hand over her mouth, because she recognized that voice, recognized that wrong rhythm, recognized her brother through the one thing nobody could surgically recreate, nobody could imitate, nobody could steal. She shoved her chair back, ran across the room, and threw herself into Grant's arms. Grant. Colette was still holding Grant when Leon drew the gun. He pulled it from the back of his waistband, quick and clean, with his dominant left hand, and no one in the room reacted in time because everyone was watching Colette sob in Grant's arms. In that single moment, the whole room had forgotten that the man standing at the head of the table wasn't only an imposter. He was Leon Hargrove, an FBI wanted drug kingpin, 12 confirmed bodies behind him, and he had no intention of standing there waiting to be captured. Leon aimed at Grant and pulled the trigger. A Marine's instinct didn't need permission from the brain. It fired straight from the spine into the legs, and Warren launched himself from the side entrance where he had been stationed according to the plan, covering the 3 meters between himself and Grant, and took the bullet in his left flank. The impact tore through the side of his abdomen, a brutal twist of fate for a man who had survived a shot to the shoulder in Manhattan just weeks prior. The bullet missed his vital organs by centimeters, but the shearing pain did nothing to stop his momentum. Warren twisted as he fell, and in that turn his right hand had already drawn the Glock from his shoulder holster and fired. 1 shot. It struck Leon's left leg just above the knee. Leon collapsed, the gun flying from his hand, skidding across the marble floor and spinning 3 full times before stopping beneath the banquet table. The room erupted into chaos. Women screamed, chairs toppled, glasses shattered, Soldiers drew guns but didn't know where to aim because 2 seconds earlier they had one boss and now they had two. One standing with his sister in his arms and the other bleeding on the floor. The same face, the same voice, and every man looked to the man beside him for an answer nobody had. Grant pushed Colette toward Lydia. Hold her. Then he walked toward Leon. Slow steps across the marble floor now streaked with blood from where Leon had fallen. He picked up Leon's gun from beneath the table, removed the magazine, and tossed it aside. Conrad ran. While every eye focused on Leon and Grant, Conrad slipped toward the front door, moving quickly but not quite running, the walk of a man trying to appear calm while everything around him collapsed. But Vince, the capo responsible for the southern transport route, the man who had nodded approval when the Baltimore route reopened in the second week and now understood he had been deceived, stepped over and blocked the door. 2 other soldiers moved behind Vince. Conrad stopped 2 steps from the exit, looked at Vince, looked at the 2 soldiers, then looked back into the room, where Grant was nearing Leon. He knew it was over. Outside the estate gates, 100 meters from the ballroom, Paxton Albright sat inside a black Mercedes with dark-tinted windows, engine running, 2 escort cars waiting behind him. He had arrived according to the plan with Conrad, wait outside the gates, and when Conrad sent the signal, Albright's men would enter, announce the new alliance, and the Corsaro family would officially be swallowed in front of 200 witnesses. But the signal never came. Instead, Paxton heard gunfire from inside the house, then screaming, then silence, then screaming again. The driver looked at him through the rearview mirror. Paxton sat still for 10 seconds, calculating, then said one word: go. 3 cars left the estate gates in the night without turning on their headlights, and Paxton Albright wouldn't return to the East Coast for a very long time. Inside the ballroom, Grant stood in front of Leon. Leon lay on the marble floor with his back against the leg of the table, his left hand clutching his bleeding leg, looking up at Grant with Grant's own face. The face Pemberton had spent 14 hours creating. The jawline, the nose, the corners of the eyes, all identical, and now that face was smiling, blood from his bitten lower lip running through his teeth, staining the grin red. You made me, Leon said, his voice hoarse but each word clear. You brought me into your house, let me wear your clothes, sit in your chair, sleep in your bed. You taught me how to become you and then acted surprised when I did. Don't forget that. Grant looked down at him, looked at his own face on his enemy's face, looked at that bloody smile, and knew Leon was right. In part, he had created this monster. He had opened the door and invited the wolf inside. I only gave you a face, Grant said, his voice no louder than a whisper. But the whole room heard him, because no one dared to breathe. What you did with it was yours. Leon laughed once more, blood and teeth, and Warren, sitting against the wall with one hand pressed over his blood-soaked left flank, nodded toward the 2 nearest soldiers. They moved in, restrained Leon, pulled his arms behind his back, and forced him face down onto the marble floor. Betty Ann Price had polished every morning for 30 years. Grant turned toward the front door, where Conrad stood between Vince and 2 soldiers, hands hanging at his sides, face no longer white now but changed into something else, something Grant recognized, because he had seen it in the mirror every morning for 8 years. Acceptance. Not acceptance of defeat. Acceptance that the game was over, and there was nothing left to hide. Grant looked at Conrad, and the look in his eyes then wasn't the look of a crime boss staring down a traitor. It wasn't the look of a boss facing the lieutenant who sold him. It was the look of a younger brother looking at his older brother. For the last time, Leon Hargrove was handed over to the FBI 2 days after the night of the party. Grant didn't deliver him personally. He used a channel inside the Department of Justice that he had quietly built over 8 years in power. One call to the right person, at the right time, with the right information, the location of the federal government's most wanted fugitive, a face that had changed but fingerprints and DNA that no surgery could erase. The FBI took custody of Leon at a transfer point outside Trenton, New Jersey, at 4 a.m, and the next day every morning news broadcast announced that Leon Hargrove, the drug kingpin hunted for 6 years, had been captured in a classified operation whose details remained undisclosed. The federal government got its top fugitive. Grant got peace. An unspoken agreement, the only language both the law and the underworld understood. Conrad was taken down to the estate basement the night after the party. Small room, concrete walls, one overhead bulb, 2 chairs and a wooden table. Grant sat on one side. Conrad sat across from him. Between them, resting on the table, was the letter. The letter their father had written but never sent. The letter calling Conrad his son. The letter apologizing for the cowardice of a man who had been the most powerful figure on the East Coast, but still lacked the courage to acknowledge his own child in front of his wife. Grant looked at Conrad. Conrad looked at the letter. Silence stretched long enough for the sound of water dripping somewhere inside the old pipes in the wall. "Dad was wrong," Grant said. "He was wrong not to claim you. Wrong to let you live in this house for decades as an outsider when you were blood. Wrong to write this letter and never send it." Conrad didn't look up. "But you killed him," Grant continued. 8 years ago, you arranged for Albright's people to enter the warehouse on Staten Island and let them do the thing you couldn't do yourself. Then you killed Betty Ann. She held you. She held me. She cooked for both of us for 30 years. She had nothing to do with what happened with Dad. She died because of you." Conrad finally looked up. His eyes were red but dry, the kind of red belonging to someone who cried themselves empty a long time ago, or never allowed themselves to cry at all. "Do you know," Conrad said, his voice rough, "what it feels like to grow up inside your own home and still be treated like an outsider? Your father, my father, looked at me every day, and chose not to acknowledge me. You were called by your name. I was called by my position. You sat at the head of the table. I sat at the right. 26 years, Grant. Year after year, Grant. All those years of serving your father, and then serving you, always forced to sit on the right side of the throne that should have been half mine." Grant didn't answer immediately. He placed his hand on the letter and slowly pushed it across the table toward Conrad. "Keep it. This is the only thing Dad left for you. I'm not taking it." Conrad stared at the letter. His hand reached out and touched the edge of the paper before pulling it toward himself. He held it with both hands, gently, like holding something both precious and breakable. "You'll leave the United States before morning," Grant said. "I arranged the papers. You won't come back. If I see your face again, I won't talk next time." Conrad stood, slipped the letter into the inside pocket of his jacket, walked toward the door. At the doorway he stopped. Didn't turn around, just stopped. "Little brother." 2 words. Quiet. Almost impossible to hear. Grant didn't turn back, but he heard them, and he closed his eyes for 1 second before opening them and walking in the opposite direction. Warren lay in Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan. Private room, 7th floor, 2 soldiers guarding the door. The bullet had been removed. His midsection was wrapped heavily in bandages to bind the torn flank, and Warren lay there with the irritated expression of a man who hated hospitals more than being shot. Grant arrived at 10 at night. He didn't knock. He walked in, pulled up a chair beside the bed, and sat there, without speaking. Exactly like that night at O'Malley's 3 years earlier, when Warren called at 3 in the morning and Grant drove over and sat beside him until sunrise without asking a single question. Warren opened his eyes, looked at Grant. "You're sitting here again. Habit. I got shot twice because of you. First the shoulder, now the flank. You're running out of places for me to take a bullet. Next time I'll tell them to use the other one for balance." Warren laughed, then winced because laughing pulled the damaged muscle. "Don't make me laugh." Grant appointed Warren as the new lieutenant right there beside the hospital bed. No ceremony, no meeting, just 1 sentence. "The seat at my right side is empty. Sit there." Warren looked at him. "I hate meetings. I know. That's why you'll sit there." Dr. Hale Pemberton received a call from Grant 2 days later. No threats. No debt collection. Just 1 request. 5 years of free service at the South Bronx Community Clinic, where people without insurance, without money, without anyone who noticed they existed, needed a good doctor. "You owe the world more than you owe me," Grant said. Pemberton agreed without hesitation. Long Island Estate. Night. The party was over. The soldiers had gone. The wine had been cleared away. The marble floor had been cleaned of blood, though Lydia knew she would always see that stain whenever she walked past, even if it no longer existed. She sat on the grand staircase in the main hall, heels removed, bare feet against the cold stone. Grant came and sat beside her. Didn't speak. She didn't either. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't the old silence, the silence of Grant because he didn't know how to speak. It was the silence of 2 people, trying to find where to begin again. Lydia spoke first. "He was gentler than you, asked about me more than you, looked at me longer than you, touched me more softly than you." Grant didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed ahead into the empty hall. There was a moment. Lydia continued softly, not accusing, only telling the truth, when I wondered why the fake version gave me more than the real one. And that question hurt more than anything he did. Grant closed his eyes. But I still knew it wasn't you. She turned toward him. Because you love me with the things you don't say. With 7 nights standing in the rain outside the hospital, without opening your mouth. With the way you leave your keys on the table every evening so I know you came home. With the way you pull me closer at 3 a.m. when you think I'm asleep. She placed her hand over his chest. Over the scar. That's the thing nobody can fake. Because to fake that, you'd have to know how to love by not knowing how to love. And only you do that. Grant opened his eyes. Looked at her. For the first time in a long time, his eyes weren't a boss's eyes. Just the eyes of a man who had almost lost the only thing he couldn't buy back, and was now sitting beside it on a staircase. I fought over a stray cat, he said. Lydia looked at him. Understood. That sentence wasn't about the cat. It was Grant saying he knew he could become better. That somewhere inside him, the 15-year-old boy who fought for the right thing still existed. And he wanted to find that boy again for her. Then start, she said. He took her hand. Said nothing else. They sat on the staircase in a mansion too large for 2 people. And for the first time, the silence between them wasn't because he didn't know what to say. It was because nothing needed saying. The next morning, Grant took the Corsaro family ring from Leon's hand before the FBI arrived, wiped the blood from it with the edge of his shirt, and walked into the bedroom. He placed the ring on Lydia's vanity beside the handwritten engagement card she kept inside her jewelry box. He didn't put it back on. Because real power doesn't need symbols. It only needs the right person to recognize you in the dark when you have nothing left except yourself. And if this story touched something inside you, maybe it reminds you of a very simple truth we forget in ordinary life. Love isn't what you say. It's what you do when nobody is watching. Loyalty isn't measured by promises, but by the times you show up when everything falls apart. You can lose money, power, even identity. But the one thing nobody can take is who you are when everything else is gone. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in real life? Someone who loved you through presence instead of words? Or someone you trusted completely before realizing you were wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments. We listen to every story, every thought that comes from deep in your heart, because that's why we tell stories every day. If you think this story deserves to be heard by more people, press like, share it with someone you care about, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time, because the stories coming next go deeper, hit harder, and we don't want you to miss them. Thank you sincerely to everyone who stayed until the final minute, wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.